Hello friends, Jules here, and while many gamers salivate at the prospect of open-world titles filled with near-endless amounts of content, there does come a time where enough is enough, and it's clear that a game is just wildly overstuffed with a rather overwhelming amount of things to do. Stuff for stuff's sake has been a real issue of games as of late, and now I'm presenting a list stuffed full of some swollen examples. But you know what? There's always room for one more wafer-thin take, and this week we've selected Katie Blade's suggestion to become a full-fledged entry. And if you want to be a part of next week's video, then have a think about what you pick as a DLC that saved a video game franchise. And yes, I know I'm asking you to do more things on a list about doing too much, but just have a think about it when you get the time. For now though, let's crack on as I'm Jules, this is FGS, and these are 10 open world games with too much to do. Number 10, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Though Assassin's Creed Odyssey saw the stealth action franchise successfully transition into full-fat open world RPG territory, follow-up Valhalla swiftly demonstrated how there could be too much of a good thing. Perhaps the single biggest complaint from critics and players alike was that Valhalla's gameplay loop was just too demanding of the player's time, to the point that it devolved into a stamina-annihilating slog long before its story wrapped up. As gorgeous as Valhalla's open world is, spanning from Norway to England, the 60-hour story is packed to the gills with repetitive missions. And that's before we even get to the ludicrous amount of copy-paste open world filler content that is typical of many Ubisoft releases. This is a tiring game to roll credits on, let alone press forward with for the additional 60 or so hours of side content, all too happy to suck up your time. Surprisingly, Ubisoft actually took player feedback on board here, as Valhalla follow-up Assassin's Creed Mirage had a svelte 15-hour campaign similar to earlier pre-open world entries into the franchise. Number 9, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. We're just going to come out and say it now, as amazing as Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is, it was also bloody exhausting to get through at points. Even accepting that much of Rebirth's open world content is entirely optional, the game's critical path will still take speedy players around 50 hours to get through. And that's because the campaign is so obviously padded out with bloat. The never-ending spat of mandatory mini-games and continual divergences from the main story, many of which should have clearly been optional side quests. There's a brilliant 30-hour story mode inside of Rebirth's distented 50 hours, and so without even factoring in the time that you'll inevitably devote to side content, you might feel well tired by the time that the end credits roll. Add to this the reams of world intel busy work on offer, and Rebirth is a game whose undeniably gorgeous world is excessively populated with generic open world slop that is clearly intended to be played while listening to a podcast. Number 8, Fable 3. Now here's the thing, there are of course a lot of huge open world sandbox style games that chuck in so much micro questing and exploring for Chiefs that they become a chore that you might not even consider Fable 3 for a list like this. But make no mistake, as Katie Blade points out themselves, there's a ton to do in this game, such as all the side missions, getting jobs, opening the demon doors, and of course getting people to like you. Thankfully, unlike real life where you biff the water cooler onto the floor and soak the shoes of your new colleagues on the first day, Fable 3 does allow you to shake off bad first impressions, but the sheer amount of effort that you need to put into this game to come close to completing it, well, it's quite staggering. You'll always be juggling several things at once, from managing your properties to trying to figure out what riddle the doors are asking you to solve, to venturing out into the wilderness to find trinkets and treasures. It'll be exhausting just opening up your to-do list. Thankfully though, Fable 3's quirky charm means that even when you're burnt out, a quick kick of a nearby chicken will likely elevate your mood and get you back on track. Number 7, FarCry 6. Ubisoft strikes again, and it won't be the last time that we see them on this list either. I know, shocker, right? Though the Far Cry franchise has actually been open world since its inception, it wasn't until the third game that the series truly solidified what would become the Ubisoft open world blueprint. Far Cry 3 introduced radio towers to open up the map, a comprehensive crafting system, collectible gubbins, and an overall bevy of things to do, indicated by a flood of icons on the game's map. The many sequels and spin-offs have clung firm to this successful formula, but by the time Far Cry 6 was released in 2021, all but the series' most die-hard fans were actually invested in it. By this point, any charm of the open world schematic had been worn down to the nub, leaving behind a charmlessly mechanical assemblage of tasks that even the great villain Anton Castillo couldn't make interesting. As the worst reviewed mainline Far Cry game, many rightly felt that Far Cry 6 was simply going through the tired motions, listlessly regurgitating the same dull generic scenarios and mission types with very little in the way of innovation. Even accepting that the campaign can be beaten in a seemingly reasonable 20 hours, it still feels grossly overstuffed. Number 6. Dragon Age Inquisition. In the decade since its release, Dragon Age Inquisition's player reception has kind of floundered considerably, possibly due to a growing distaste for open-world filler among the masses. Despite winning numerous Game of the Year awards, today Inquisition's rep is decidedly more lukewarm, with many pointing to the game's utter inability to respect the player's time. Even skirting the seemingly never-ending barrage of side content fluff, you'll probably spend upwards of 50 hours getting to the end of Dragon Age Inquisition, especially if you don't leave the opening hinterlands area in a timely manner. It's possible to spend dozens of hours here doing stuff, but not actually accruing any progress in the story, enough that fatigue may well set in once you actually do try to get things going. The abundance of fetch quests, even in the main story, ultimately becomes a mind-numbing distraction from its far more intriguing narrative elements, at which point you may well wish that BioWare actually made something else that was more modestly scaled. Number 5. Death Stranding. As fantastic as Death Stranding generally is, Hideo Kojima's mesmerizing AAA delivery sim is also a prime example of a game that just did not know how to end. Even players who put the pedal to the metal will struggle to race through the story in under 40 hours, making this about as long as the first 3 Metal Gear Solid games combined. There are 70 mandatory story missions to beat, many of which feel like momentum-devoid filler, especially in the middle hours of the game, ahead of an ending sequence that goes on for about 2 hours alone. Even accepting that Death Stranding is designed to be a somewhat zen, relaxed experience when you're not busy fighting off BTs, by the game's end, it truly feels like Kojima over-egged the omelette. To take the food metaphor one step further, this is a game designed to make you feel bloated and tired by the end, over-gorging itself on an otherwise pretty quality meal. And this, of course, doesn't even cover the array of non-essential deliveries you can take on, ensuring that Death Stranding often feels more anxiously overwhelming than actually chill. Number 4. Immortals Fenyx Rising. Immortals Fenyx Rising is actually one of the most pleasant surprises to come from Ubisoft in the last 5 years. But while shamelessly indebted to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, this light-hearted open-world adventure game offers up an amusingly silly travelogue through Greek mythology by way of fun traversal and combat mechanics. Its colourful open world is even pretty fun to explore, that is, until it isn't. Yes, it's easy enough to sidestep most of the typical Ubisoft collectathon nonsense, but even the golden path feels egregiously overlong at around 25 hours. There's a clearly drum-type 15 to 20 hour experience here, but the central gameplay loop is so frequently bogged down by exhausting puzzle-based dungeons that you'll surely wish it was over way before it finally ends. The final few hours of this game in particular are such a tiring slog that you couldn't be blamed for tapping out altogether, as it continually hurls a barrage of busy work at you before you can tackle the final boss. The feeling of burnout is real, even though Immortals Fenyx Rising is one of the more charming renditions of the publisher's open-world template in recent times. Number 3. Ghost of Tsushima. This one might ruffle a few feathers, but as beautiful as Ghost of Tsushima's open world undeniably is, it's also populated with a whole lot of agonizingly time-consuming guff. Yeah, we said it, right? In many ways, this feels like the feudal Assassin's Creed game that fans spent years asking for, right down to the abundance of generic objectives, markers, and points of interest that it's constantly shuttling you towards, as though the game feeds directly off of your time. Sure, the fresh flavor of the Japanese setting lets Ghost of Tsushima fend off staleness for a little longer than it otherwise might have, but once you master its combat, even the central story missions feel like a continual bombardment of the same damn thing ad nauseum. The game's success likely means that developer Sucker Punch will not deviate from this formula for the upcoming sequel, Ghosts of Yotei, but a less is more approach would actually be kind of nice. Number 2. Days Gone. Days Gone certainly has its fans, but even many of them will admit that the game grossly overextends itself relative to the worthwhile content that it offers. The post-apocalyptic actionist story is spread rather thinly across a lackadaisical 40-hour campaign that's light on actual narrative, but heavy on repetitive missions. This is especially true of the glut of stealth missions that are peppered throughout. Needing to refuel and tend to your motorcycle meanwhile makes even basic traversal and exploration kind of a bore, and overall it's tough not to feel like a simple 20-hour zombie action game was needlessly stretched out into a turgid RPG-adjacent bloatfest running double that. It's a game that will leave you begging for it to be over by the end, and that's not because taking on the undead hordes isn't fun, it's because the developers clearly thought the ancillary activities were way more interesting than they actually are. And number 1, Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Even players who don't try to tick off everything that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has to offer will find themselves spending 60 hours and beyond trying to get through the main story. It is is unquestionably the most content-fat game in the hit RPG series, but even the most basic facets of gameplay feel over-encumbered with excessive systems. From character equipment to upgrades and even combat itself, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 feels duty-bound to turn what should be snappy gameplay into a glorified Senate hearing, to say nothing of its actual dialogue exchanges, which are leaden to the point of self-parody.
You've got a lot of nerve, you one-eyed monster!
It is a game that desperately needed to be streamlined in the design process, because by the time that you're introduced to the dozenth arcane gameplay mechanic, you can probably feel the beginnings of a cluster migraine coming on. As great as this franchise is, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 made playing it feel like, well, the worst thing that any video game can do, and that is like having a second bloody job. And there we go, my friends. Those were 10 open world games with too much to do. Hope you enjoyed that, and let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section below. And while you're there, have a think about what you'd pick as a DLC that saved a video game franchise. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me over on Blue Sky, where I'm at RetroJ, but the O is a 0. Hope you're treating yourself well, my friend, with love and respect, because you deserve the bloody best. And I'll speak to you soon, alright? Bye.